I've been coming to Lexington, Massachusetts for almost 55 years, and this is the best day that I've ever been here. I've visited relatives, I've visited friends, I courted a woman who became my wife here, but I have to say that this is a hugely important day. As a young boy, I grew up sort of dreaming of this mythical place called Lexington. I had the first opportunity to come here, and I stopped and looked at the statue of Parker and thought about what had taken place. I've buried the lead. On November 16th, PBS will begin broadcasting and streaming our 6-part, 12-hour history of the American Revolution, which we have been working on for almost a decade. It, of course, tells the story of what happened here at the very end of our first episode, the shot heard round the world.
The American Revolution as a subject. You've covered so many things over the course of your career. The American Revolution, the way I heard you at the press conference this morning talking about how you sort of connected with it, sort of on a personal level as a young person and history. And I noticed that your work doesn't necessarily follow any particular format. You finally come to the American Revolution. What brought you here finally?
I think it's the way we choose our friends. It's when you fall in love. You have lots of ideas all the time. I was finishing a series on the history of the Vietnam War. It was still a year and a half from broadcast, but we were locking the picture, and December of 2015, and I turned to Sarah Botstein and others, and I said, we're doing the American Revolution next. And it was just this gut sense that we had done the Civil War, we'd leapt ahead to the Second World War. We made a film in 2007 called The War, and then before that was dry, we decided on Vietnam, and that had been a 10-and-a-half-year process, and it just seemed like I was maybe prepared, old enough, wise enough, foolish enough to tackle, our, as Rick says in the film, our origin story, our origin myth, which is, part of the difficulty is that it is so smothered in mythology that you have to do a lot of archaeological work to get beyond the sentimentality and the nostalgia that attends to the revolution in ways it doesn't attend to other wars. Obviously, the Civil War suffers from misinformation and disinformation, but we've accepted the violence of it in a way, and we don't do that with the American Revolution, and it's a really violent story, and it's important, as the historian Maya Jasanoff says in our film, that we understand the United States is born in violence. So it's just, you realize there's a kind of, and I'm sure it's true for Rick, you kind of go, uh-oh, what did I just say? But it's falling in love too, so that there's never a moment in which it disappoints you.
Right, and it seems to get more violent as it goes on, as the British Empire starts to see that they're losing ground, and I think they start to employ other tactics?
Well, for Hannah Davis of Acton, Massachusetts, the North Bridge at Concord is as violent as it's ever going to get because her husband, Isaac, is killed in the first instant of the North Bridge stuff. But you're right, you don't want to be, this is a symphony in 3 amazing movements, right? It begins in New England, particularly Boston, and it moves down to the mid-Atlantic, and then it drops down to the deep south and moves its way up, culminating in Virginia. You do not want to be a civilian or anybody in New Jersey or South Carolina particularly during this war because of it's not to say that parts of New York State and parts of Virginia and parts of Pennsylvania aren't battlegrounds for civilians, but New Jersey and South Carolina are pretty bad. More British and Hessian troops are killed in guerrilla attacks in New Jersey than in the battles that were fought there, and they're not significant except the last one, but Trenton and Princeton and Monmouth Courthouse. But so you can understand the guerrilla nature of the war. The British used the word pacification, or ring a bell with Vietnam. Certainly that's true in South Carolina, and they've got it all pacified until they don't. And then it just completely, in both states, just goes to hell in a quick second. And it's pretty brutal. It's pretty bad.
Right. Well, since we're sitting here in Lexington, let's talk about the evening of April 18th, 1775. It starts, the movement starts. They get the word that the British regulars were moving towards Lexington for a couple of reasons. One is the armament that left over from the French and Indian War that was sort of put aside in Concord. They're aware of that, they want that, and they also want the two principal players, Sam Adams and John Hancock, and they had intelligence that they were here in Lexington. That sort of set them in motion. They're coming to Lexington. Do you think they imagined that there would be 77 steadfast farmers and shopkeepers and neighbors standing their ground at the Lexington Green?
No, and they're actually not looking for Adams and Hancock at that point. The orders from London have specified ringleaders, but General Gage, the British commander in Boston, says, I'm not chasing those guys all over New England. What he is looking for are the munitions that you refer to. And they have good intelligence, the British do, and know that there are caches, particularly in Concord, but in this area. No, 800 men try and tiptoe out of Boston. Obviously, the alarm goes up early on with William Dawes and Paul Revere. 200 of those 800 are sent ahead as a vanguard to try and capture the bridges over the Concord River. And what do they find when they get to Lexington? They find what had been about 150 militiamen, about half that number still on the green when they arrive just after dawn. Throw down your weapons, ye rebels. And in fact, they're turning around, most of them, to leave the green, recognizing that they're overpowered. A shot rings out. No one knows who fired that first shot, but it leads to rather undisciplined firing by the British. It goes on for several minutes, and you end up with 8 people dead and 10 wounded on Lexington Green, and it's the beginning of 3,059 days of war.
That morning when they got up, had their breakfast or whatever, came to the green knowing that they were going to stand their ground. They never, I don't think, in my opinion, they thought that this would be the beginning of the American Revolution, that they would die that day and not see their families ever again, and their families would not be there, because I know they had a bit of an evacuation. The women was sort of getting everybody and taking them away, but in the end, those men were lost to their families. Then it went forward. Then they go from there on to Concord. And I know you called it a massacre. I think it was in your opening remarks, I read something about how it wasn't a battle, it wasn't a skirmish, it was a massacre. Is that true?
That's true. Because they're outgunned, they're overmatched, they're willing to retreat without firing. That doesn't happen. You know, most of the militiamen who were on the green that day fired no more than one shot. Some of them didn't even get off a shot. Most of them who were killed were shot in the back. Yeah, not a man woke up that morning or late previous night believing that he was going to die that day. And that's what war is about. But by the time the column reaches Concord, the word has spread throughout the countryside, and they're waiting for them, and they're ready in Concord.
Right. At Miriam's Corner, and then there's the retreat, and Parker's Revenge, and all of that. And then of course during the retreat they get to Arlington, and I think it was at the Jason Russell House that they really started. Well, you talk about ugliness. That was a very ugly scene.
I think the whole retreat is pretty revealing of what kind of war it's going to be for the most part, or in many instances, and the British aren't prepared for it, and I think the Patriots understanding the nature of their insurgency, they're killing us, as Rick says in our film, you know, and that the only thing to do is, you know, he says the genie's out of the bottle. You're not going to put this back in, and so that retreat is terrible. And in monotony, what we now know as Arlington is just, it's pretty horrible. And the British are being pummeled, but so are the Patriots, are dying along the battle road as well. And
is it safe to say that the British regulars approached this with some level of arrogance, thinking that they were just going to walk in and get what they wanted?
That's a hard question. You know, I think what Rick said, we can dream and imagine what battle is like unless you've been in it, which I have not been in. We can't appreciate what in the middle of combat what goes through a person's mind. Yes, we know that Pitcairn had a certain disdain for the rebels, as the British called them. We know that you are a member of one of the great military powers on earth. These are peasants. You've got to assume some things, and there, and later at Bunker Hill, and later when we are really doing our job as an insurgency force at, say, Trenton, we're confounding them. And if you add the dynamics of headquarters is 3,000 miles away, the continent is hugely big, and nobody knows what weather is coming, all of these things contribute to the fact that, as Washington learns gradually, that he doesn't have to win, he just can't lose. And so the British have to win. They have to win, and that's where the whole nub of it is militarily.
And Captain Parker, the Lexington militia, they weren't officially Minutemen at the time. They not only did they continue the effort, Prince Estabrook, an enslaved man with the Estabrook family, fought on the green. Captain Parker, who was sick at the time with tuberculosis, goes on to, with the entire company, to join the battle at Bunker Hill. And it made quite a difference, because at that point they were all sort of together in this. Accurate?
I would defer to Rick's expertise on that.
Yeah, I mean, Parker is remarkable for several reasons. One, like one of every 4 adult men in Massachusetts, he's got combat experience. He fought in the French and Indian War. And he's dying of tuberculosis. He'll be dead in a year. There's something about him, looking at him in retrospect, there's nothing to lose for him. So he's presiding over what I call a massacre on Lexington Green, but then he's going to fight later in the day on Battle Road as the British column is retreating. There's some level of vengeance. There's those 8 dead in Lexington are avenged by his men. At that point, it looks as though that British column of 800 may be annihilated. And it's only the fact that belatedly a relief column has come out from Boston, 1,000 men, and here in Lexington basically takes the bedraggled column that had gone out initially under their wing and saves them, because it really looks as though it's going to be a massacre of that entire column. And Parker's very much a part of that.
And let's, I had mentioned Prince Estabrook, an enslaved man. There were actually several enslaved folks who joined the battle, eventually winning their freedom or achieving their freedom, not necessarily through their service, but through the gratitude. Prince Estabrook went off to live with the Estabrooks, I believe, in Sudbury. One of the Estabrook children. So, I mean, they continued to stay together, which I thought was a nice, interesting part of that story. One of the things that's important to you are young minds. I hear you talk about it all the time, and this evening when you're going to be doing your presentation, you've asked to make sure that a certain number of seats are put aside for school-age children.
And right now.
Today, I mean,
yeah.
today and in Concord.
Today and in Concord, yeah.
Right. Why is that so important to you?
Well, I think for a variety of reasons. One, I've spent my entire professional life providing our films, giving our films to PBS. And one of the reasons is that after the broadcast, which, is like skywriting, disappearing in the first Zephyr, unlike them, they play it again and again, and it goes into schools. They know how to reach every classroom in America, and that's really important. So today, for example, is a school day in America, and while our Revolution film isn't done yet, I know that hundreds of classrooms are looking at a portion of the Civil War series and many of the other films that we made, and that's really, really important. Particularly today, as we atrophy so much interest and knowledge of history, that our social media becomes so distracting, the attention spans get eroded even further than they are. It's really important. You want to maintain an enlightened citizenship. This is what the revolution is about. We're now no longer subjects. We're now citizens. But that requires an enormous amount of responsibility. And part of that, they all would reach back, the founders, into the classics, to classical period, and pull out virtues of humility and temperance and moderation and all sorts of things. But the virtue that they were looking for, the humility that they sought, was a kind of lifelong learning. That's what the pursuit of happiness is about. It's not material wealth. And so I think for us to just re-articulate and re-amplify these founding principles and how sacred and how much responsibility attends to real citizenship is a huge, important mission that we all have to do. Otherwise, you take a retreat back and you become, as Pitcairn is dismissively saying, just peasants. You don't want to be peasants, because peasants are subjects, and peasants are subject to superstitions and error to misinformation. And so when you have an educated citizenry, you've got the beginnings of the possibility of continuing a republic.
You talk about it, the shot of unknown origin. It ignites the war for independence here in Lexington. Since that time, Concord and Lexington have been fighting over who fired the first shot. Do you dare say that it's a euphemism for that shot of unknown origin? I know that the reference comes years later with Emerson and Longfellow and all of that, but does that do I make a strong case for that as you so?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that partially answers that. It's estimated that the rebels, the Americans, fired 75,000 rounds that day, Lexington, Concord, and the retreat to Boston. About 1 of every 300 rounds actually hit a redcoat. Muskets were notoriously inaccurate, almost hopeless beyond 100 yards. So the shot heard around the world probably missed. Mm-hmm. There's no doubt that the first gunfire was in Lexington. Whether it came from the British side or from the American side, no one will ever know.
I generally like to romanticize it and say we don't know where the shot came from, but it did ignite the war for independence. So maybe I'm personally taking ownership. But
so rather than the mythology of it, we can take from Rick and his extraordinary scholarship the idea that it may have been a miss. We don't know where it came from. We do know that it was a massacre and not a battle or even a skirmish, and that the success that the Patriots would have later on in the day, the rebels as the British called them, may be in large measure due to the desire for revenge against the death of friends, and not so much the big ideas of liberty, which is always part of it. I mean, we can talk about when you're in a foxhole, it's not about this, it's saving your friend and it's trying to save alive. And these are important truths of war that the mythologies tend to overspread, and the idea that Concord and Lexington could waste a lot of time debating this is distracting from the ultimate grow that this is the birth of the United States.
Right. Any surprises in this research?
Every day, 1,000 times a day.
Every time you
Happily.
look at something,
Yeah.
is there anything particular? And I know this is our last question. Did you come across anything that kind of ran, opposite to what your conventional thinking might have been?
Every single day. That's the whole joy of this, is the prospecting, the gold that you turn up. And sometimes it takes a long time to hit that seam, but whatever you thought, it's much more complicated. I have a neon sign in my editing room, and it says, "It's complicated," because it is.
Well, thank you both so much, Rick and Ken. I really appreciate you taking the time, and welcome to Lexington. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Nice to see you, Rick.